We would like to welcome Professor Chang. Today he was awarded with the Doctor Honoris Causa at the University of Chile. We are very happy to have you here. We're going to have a conversation in order to have it in our web page so you can all check and see the main ideas. We are here with Professor José Miguel Ahumada, who did the PhD with Professor Chang in Cambridge. Professor Chang, we would like to ask you, how do you define development?
Well, for me, development starts with the transformation of the economic structure. And of course, development is a broader concept than economic development. It's a general kind of transformation of society in a more kind of productive, more progressive direction. But yeah, at the heart of it is the transformation of the economic structure. And yeah, in that sense, although not in other senses, I'm very Marxist. You know? So the transformation of the sphere of production, how we produce things, you know, what kind of technology are employed, how people's work is transformed. You know? So in general, I would say the transformation based upon increase in productive capabilities, so using higher technologies, using better organizations, having better coordination between the firms and between firms and government and firms and the universities. And of course, when you have this material transformation, people's kind of, other aspects of people's lives are also transformed. So there's the urbanization, you know, the increased participation of women in the labor market, which leads to changes in the power relationship between different genders, you know, the way we raise our family, the way we invest in our children in terms of education, you know, a whole range of things get transformed in a way that gives us not just more kind of material comfort, but also more kind of I don't know. I mean that if I may put it like that, more equal relationships between different groups of people, more respect for different groups, more, if you like, human rights, more rights for the minorities. So, I mean, of course, I mean, I'm not trying to paint a completely rosy picture because development process can also be very disruptive, very conflictual. You know? And yeah, it inevitably destroys some of the traditional ways of life, and some people who put great value in preserving, you know, tradition, you know, indigenous culture and so on, that might be quite unhappy about the process. So not trying to, you know, say that development is 100% positive, but you know, basically, my view of development is very much shaped by my personal experience. I mean, growing up in, you know, South Korea in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, at the decades of so-called economic miracle, I really could see with own eyes how this material transformation have positive impact overall on people's lives, both materially and also in terms of social relations.
One of the important things that you have put the emphasis on, in not only in economic development literature, but in economics as a discipline, is that economics is a political argument.
Yeah.
Right, and that goes against most of the common ideas about economics, right? As it is the field of equilibrium, you know, where different individual utilities reach this point where quantities and prices get this equilibrium. Why do you say that economics is a political argument? What is the theory behind it?
Yeah, I mean this argument has actually many layers. You know? So at the very superficial level, you know, economics that talks about, in a lot of cases, economic policy, you know, that even if it's in relatively abstract mathematical models and so on. A lot of it is about how public intervention can improve social welfare, how different ways of, I don't know, managing macroeconomic policy has the positive or negative impact on the economy. So that a lot of it is about policy, and policy is inevitably political. I mean, of course, the economists like to present it as based on scientific argument, but basically that depending on the assumptions you make, the kind of data you use, you can defend many different types of policies. So at the most superficial level, because economics is about economic policy, it has to take into account the effect of politics. So in that sense, it's inseparable from politics, but also that is a deeper sense in which the economics is a political argument. And there are two aspects, one deeper and the other deepest. So the deeper aspect is that a lot of our economic relationships are based on power relationships. So of course that economists deny that there's power at work, except when there's monopoly and what they call the market power. But without even monopoly, there's power everywhere. Because what options people have is defined by the distribution of existing distribution of income and asset. So in that regard, my favorite quote comes from the Brazilian bishop Dom Helder Camara, one of the leaders of liberation theology, who said that when I give food to poor people, they call me a saint. But when I ask why these people do not have enough to eat, they call me a communist. These people so that Helder Camara was pointing out that once that you begin to question the underlying social order, people think you're a communist. And that social order is underlying all economic relationships, which ostensibly look politics-free, power-free. I go to the labor market as a worker who can sell labor power. You come to the labor market as an employer. We haggle over the price. We accept what each of us find profitable. So there's no power relationship. Is that true? Even Adam Smith pointed out that workers have to work, otherwise they'll starve to death, whereas capitalists can not have to invest for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years because they have money to survive. So there is what I call structural power in the economy, even without someone having monopoly power and so on. So that you cannot really ignore the power dimension in the economics. But at the deepest level, even what looks like a kind of politics-free market is actually based on political arrangements. Because in that regard, my favorite example is child labor. So in the 19th century, when Britain tried to introduce regulation on child labor, a lot of people were against this. They said this is putting a restriction on freedom of the contract. So these children want to work, these people want to hire them. What is your problem? Today, even the worst kind of free market economists do not say that we have to reintroduce child labor. Because the assumption about what is an acceptable contract has changed. So in that sense, this change is a very political change. It's not because we found some new economic theory that says that this is wrong. And basically my point is that the market itself is a product of politics. So all economists, however much that they pretend that they are a free market economy, have restrictions on what can be sold, what can be bought. Yeah? I mean, they have rules about how exchange can happen.
Who participates in the market?
Exactly, who participates. Yeah? I mean, if you're illegal immigrants, you cannot participate in the labor market. Well, legally at least. Yeah. If you're an immigrant laborer, you are restricted to certain professions in certain countries. You know, countries that ban the child labor. You know, all countries have require some sort of certificate for doctors to practice. Yeah? If you're a really true believer in free market, you know, why should you have a restriction on who can practice medicine? Yeah? No, let people practice medicine. If someone kills too many people, yeah, they'll stop going to the guy. Yeah? Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so the reason why we have these restrictions is not based on market logic, but because we have made a political decision that there's extra death that might be created by free market in medicine is politically unacceptable. Yeah?
So the characteristic of the markets are based on an ideological narrative that legitimize certain way of institutionalizing the market, who participates.
Exactly, yeah. And that process is completely political.
It is a complete, and then is another layer that is given this institutional basis of the market. There are like power relations between capital and labor, between business and so on. Yeah. And in the third layer, there is another layer of politics, that is the layer of policies.
That's right. Yeah.
So like the object of economics is an object that is based on these three layers of power relations.
Exactly. Yeah. So you know. This illusion that somehow economics can be free from politics, this insistence that economics has to be separated from politics. I mean, that's one central element in the neoliberal agenda, yeah? Because you cannot trust that state, you cannot trust the political process. Basically, you have to separate economics from politics as much as possible. So create politically independent central bank, create politically independent utility regulatory agencies. You know, the World Bank at one point was funding countries like Uganda and Rwanda to set up the autonomous revenue authorities. Basically, you know, in the old days, this used to be called tax farming. You know? So you set up these politically independent agencies that have a contract with the government. The government tells them, yeah, please give us, I don't know, $500 million in tax revenue. We'll pay you the 50 million out of that for your service. We don't care how you collect it. Go ahead. Yeah. You know, that was the World Bank view, but how tax should be collected. Yeah. I think that really didn't work. So they quietly wound down the program. But you know, one core element in the neoliberal agenda is to separate politics from economics. But the actual result is that
naturalizing a particular.
Exactly, yeah. These people have their own definition of what is politics and what is economics. Yeah? So it's actually imposing a particular political agenda in the name of separating economics from politics. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. In this sense, for the challenges that the institute has, what do you think are the dimensions of the? I mean, how important is to do the development studies from a multidisciplinary?
Yes, so I think, you know, every study has to be multidisciplinary in my view, but development is particularly a field that has to be multidisciplinary because you know, we are studying change, yeah? We are studying transformation, and particularly in order to understand the transformative process, you need to understand it from many different perspectives, because you know, if you are talking about a very kind of stable kind of the phenomenon, and you are looking at some technical issues there, then maybe it's okay to accept a lot of things as given and just study whether doing this will cause that and so on. But we are now talking about basically puzzled with many moving parts. Yeah? So that you have to not just understand economics, but also politics, in these three different senses. You also need to study sociology because the political process and the economic process is embedded in society, which has certain social norms and culture and way of interacting. So that unless you understand that basis, you cannot really understand economics and economics that influences politics, politics influences society, society influences economics and politics. So, yeah, and of course that you should also study things like geography and urbanization and other aspects, but at least economics, politics, sociology, I mean, these that have to be critical elements in understanding development.
Yeah, it reminds me Schumpeter that said the good economist is a person that studies statistics, history, economic theory, and sociology.
Exactly,
in order to be like a good economist. Talking about that multidisciplinary perspective in the field of development studies, you've been a very important critique. You've done a very relevant critique to the way that the international structure has been organized since at least the 80s, with the WTO, the free trade agreements agenda, and so on. During some time, the academia believed that the international system was a system of harmony. We reached the idea that liberalism and market opening was going to reach development. But you've said that the international order after the 80s has actually been guided by these bad Samaritans and have reproduced this hierarchical way.
Yeah.
Can you give us some insights about this idea that you develop in the book Bad Samaritans in relation to the international rule?
Yes, I mean, of course, you could say that things have been bad since the 80s, but compared to the 19th century when there was naked imperialism, colonialism, we are still living in a better world. So, yes. I mean, it's a matter of perspective, but at least compared to the world order between 1945 and say 1980, when there was that recognition that the most powerful countries cannot just impose their vision on the rest. The view that actually helping the weak actually is in the long run helping the strong. I mean, what may be called enlightened self-interest. I mean, that's what the Americans did with the Marshall Plan.
Exactly.
Yeah. And, initially, the American plan was not Marshall Plan. It was the Morgenthau Plan, named after the Treasury Secretary, which basically aimed to deindustrialize Germany. And the Soviet Union jumped on that plan because they said, if you want to deindustrialize Germany, we are very happy to take all the machines to the Soviet Union. So actually, the German manufacturing sector was systematically being dismantled, and then the economy just couldn't stand. And this Marshall, the state secretary at the time, was very concerned with it. Actually, the one thing that really prompted the intervention by Marshall was the visit to Germany by the former President Hoover as a special envoy. Hoover came back with a very shocking assessment. He said, yes, you can deindustrialize Germany, but only if you are willing to reduce the population from 65 million to 40 million. Yeah? That sounded alarm bell, and Marshall persuaded President Truman that this has to change. Yeah? And then they started pumping money into Europe, rebuilt Europe. Yeah, and with decolonization starting with the end of the Second World War, lasting into the 60s and 70s, there was recognition that the developing countries have to be accommodated in the new world order, but they should be allowed to accommodate, integrate into the world economy at their own pace. Yeah? So initially, the so-called GATT, General Agreement on trade and tariffs, the predecessor of the WTO, it was a plurilateral system. You know? There was no idea about a single undertaking, which is key in the WTO.
Yeah,
so
yes.
if you join the club, you have to accept every agreement. No. At the time, you are allowed to pick and choose. You know?
Yes.
So the world order, of course, I'm not saying that it was necessarily an ideal period. You know, Americans financed all sorts of coup d'etats in Latin America, in the Middle East. You know, and so that I'm not trying to present it as some kind of lost golden age, but at least there was this recognition that different countries need different arrangements. Unfortunately, after the 80s, with the rise of neoliberalism and rise of this view that there's only one truth and everyone has to follow it, you basically have seen the transformation of the world economic system into a kind of straight jacket made in the same way for everyone. Yeah? Of course, if you're a big country, you break these rules. Even if someone takes you to the WTO, you just ignore it. No, I mean, the best example is the American practice of the so-called zeroing in anti-dumping agreement, because when you calculate dumping, basically what you have to do is that, say steel is a very diverse product, so you have to compare the price of different kinds of steel. So for some things, Chinese steel will be, cheaper than the American one. For some other things, it will be more expensive. But the American practice is to ignore all the negative differences and only count the positive dumping prices. Yeah? So WTO has a rule that this is illegal for 3 times or something. Americans still do it. Yeah? So I mean, what apparently is that uniform rule for everyone doesn't apply to everyone. I mean, if you're big, if you're powerful, you just ignore it. But in this the new system, the needs of developing countries have been systematically ignored. Yeah? Okay, there is so-called special and differential treatment, but now it's very insignificant. Yeah? I mean, essentially, if you are one of the least developed countries, basically countries with less than $1,000 per capita income, then you get some extra allowance like being able to use export subsidies. But other developing countries, basically they have to use the same rules as the rich countries. Yeah? The only difference is that they get longer transition periods. Yes, so instead of tomorrow, you can implement these rules in 5 years, maybe 10 years, but no more than that. Yeah? That's completely inadequate to cater for different needs that these developing countries have. That is completely inadequate to accommodate different capabilities of different countries. So imposition of this system basically has been a huge problem, because it's basically imposing rules written in the interest of the rich countries and trying to impose it on the developing countries without any allowance. So yes, I mean, that's why I call bad Samaritans. Instead of helping people in trouble, they are actually, taking out the wallet while someone is fallen down.
To finalize, we wanted to bring you to Chile.
Yeah.
We want to ask you why we are not South Korea, or what do we need to do to reach the actual level?
Well, I don't know. Well, back in 1961, Chile had per capita income that was more than 4.5 times that of South Korea's. Chile's was 377 or 78. South Korea's was 82. Today, Korea's twice richer. So yeah, I mean, it's a natural question to ask, but I don't know. I mean, I think one thing that this country hasn't done compared to what Korea has done is that it, I mean, at least after the 73 coup d'etat, it has basically given up on doing anything sophisticated. You know? Basically, it has accepted that it will do lots of things with the natural resources. Yeah? I mean, even to the extent of creating completely new industries like salmon industry. So it's not as if Chileans never done anything new, but somehow, I mean, the Chilean elite and the policymakers have come to accept that the country should never get into sophisticated manufacturing, never get into the high productivity services. So I think it's probably a matter of ambition. No, because frankly, I mean, very few countries have actually achieved what Chile has achieved in areas
Absolutely.
like salmon or forestry. So it's not the lack of, that's right, fruits or wine. So it's not actually because of lack of capacity. Yeah? Somehow you have self-imposed this the limitation to your ambition. Yeah? We'll never make a car. Yeah? We'll never make the bioengineering products. We'll never succeed in the artificial intelligence. Yeah? Why? You know, I don't understand.
Yeah. Probably it's like a religious, ideological views that restrict that
and
policy space. Then.
Yeah, and exactly.
We
Yeah,
are market believers.
That's right. Yeah, that you have that constraint your own future.
Yeah,
So I don't know. I mean, at least there seems to be some recognition that you cannot continue in the same way that you have been in the last few decades, because growth has slowed down, productivity growth especially has slowed down even more. You know, I think that is time to do things differently and
more creatively.
Yeah, be more confident about yourself. You know, I mean, why are you so?
Believe more in the creativity.
That's right. Yeah.
More collective creativity.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Chang, for being here with
Before
us.
ending it, could we ask you if you can recommend our students and academics, the authors and the texts?
Oh yes,
that
yes.
you think?
Yeah. No. I mean, whenever I'm asked a question like this, I say 3 economists have influenced me the most, and a lot of people find this collection completely crazy. I say Karl Marx, Friedrich Hayek, and Herbert Simon. Yeah, so these are completely different people at one level in terms of their political view and in terms of the issues they wrote about, but they all share the very profound reflections on the nature of the institutions, human behavior, human motivation. I mean, in the case of Marx, the nature of technology and material transformation. So yeah, I've learned a lot from these 3 economists. Yeah, in addition to many other kind of great economists. In terms of particular text, I think, yeah, the Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation was a particularly kind of influential book on me. I mean, I don't think that as an economist he can really match kind of Marx or Hayek or the Simon, but that book itself was quite influential on me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang, for having us.
And we hope to have you soon again at the university.